Well, it's a great pleasure to have the first of our podcasts on the Olympic Games. I'm calling it Dashing Dan's Olympic Adventures. If you think there's a better name, better title out there, please get in touch with me. But that's what I'm going with at the moment. And we thank our major sponsor. Great to have them on board, Aussie Home Loans. If you want to purchase a property, you can build a property portfolio, refinancing, debt consolidation, and construction. Pre-approvals, get in touch with the crew right around Australia at Aussie Home Loans. A great pleasure today. First guest is a man I've known for a long, long time. I call him a personal friend of mine. He may not, but as I said, it's my show, so I'm going to go with the fact that he's a personal friend of mine. One of the great broadcasters of all time from the ABC. He went to 4 Olympic Games, and he was an outstanding cycling commentator, in particular at those 4 Olympic Games. I'm talking of Glenn Mitchell. Glenn, welcome to the program. Great to have you with us.
Dashing Dan, how are you? It's been a while.
It certainly has. Well, Glenn, the Olympic Games, you're a great lover of it. You're a great historian when it comes to sport. Is it losing its luster?
I think one of the issues, Dan, with the Olympic Games nowadays is that so many sports have decided that they want to increase the number and frequency of their world championships. You see how often world swimming and world track and field, for example, happens nowadays. So perhaps that does dilute the Olympics. So I think one of the other issues where people probably extrapolate is the fact that it is costing so much to stage an Olympic Games. So as a result, perhaps you're not getting as much interest from countries, or more importantly, cities and municipalities to actually put on an Olympics. So some people probably get the two confused. For Olympians and those that are involved in Olympic sports, I think they still see it pretty much as the pinnacle of their sport. But the cost of putting it on, people probably look at that and think, well, hang on, if it's so great, why aren't more cities, municipalities, and by extension countries putting in for it? But I think from an athletic point of view, if you are in an Olympic sport, whether it be winter or summer, I think you still see it as the pinnacle.
So if you were to say to an athlete that the Olympic Games are in trouble, they'd be petrified, wouldn't they?
Athletics.
Yeah. If you were to say to an athlete, the Olympic Games are in jeopardy because of the fact that it's becoming too expensive financially, they would be petrified, wouldn't they?
Definitely. No doubt about that. Especially if you're talking about sports that mightn't be at the very top end. For some of the sports that we don't hear a lot of outside an Olympic Games or the period leading into it, I think it is a massive thing. Although having said that, I mean, if we just isolate and look at Cathy Freeman as one. I mean, Cathy Freeman won a silver medal at Atlanta in 1996. She won world championships in 1997 and 1999. She won 5 Commonwealth Games gold medals. If she hadn't have won that gold medal on the track in Sydney in 2000, she would not be viewed the way she is today. The same way that we wouldn't be looking upon Kieran Perkins. He could have broken world records and done whatever he liked, but if he hadn't have had those Olympic successes, he wouldn't be seen in the same light. Shane Kelly is a classic example. You know, he was primed as the world record holder and the reigning world champion when he went to Atlanta in 1996. He'd won a silver medal 4 years earlier in Spain. He competed at another subsequent 2 Olympics in Sydney and in Athens. He won umpteen world championships, set world records, never won an Olympic gold medal. Now, people sometimes still talk about him because of the controversy and pulling his foot out of the pedal in Atlanta. But people would be talking about him in a totally different way if it was Shane Kelly, Olympic gold medalist.
Correct. An
Olympic gold medal for those participants in that sport, Dan, is still the highest currency. But we are seeing a little bit of a dilution because of the fact that, you know, swimming's gone to every 2 years, track and field's gone to every 2 years for the world championships, that I think it's becoming a very congested calendar as a result.
Now, just in regard to Shane Kelly, you called, it was your first Olympic Games, 1996 in Atlanta. You'd never called cycling before. It's not an easy sport to call. Were you nervous? I know you're one of these great callers that can just compartmentalise and just call the way you see it. I know you're a Carlton supporter, but not many people would know that. Everyone knows, sadly, that I'm a Western Bulldog supporter because I wear my heart on my sleeve. But Were you nervous for him, knowing that it was basically his to lose? He dominated the sport. He dominated the kilo, as they called it, in the lead up to the Olympic Games, as you mentioned earlier.
He was a raging favourite. In fact, so unusually, Dan, that when Sports Illustrated put out a magazine leading into the Olympics, they chose their 10 certainties to win an Olympic gold medal. And remarkably, they had an Australian cyclist in the kilometre time trial as one of the 10. He earned the nickname Minuteman. He won the World Championship the year before in '95 in Bogota in Colombia, and he rode a time of 1 minute 0.613 seconds. So he nearly became the first man to break a minute. So he earned the nickname Minuteman. 2 days before he rode, I was going to say the final, people need to keep in mind that the kilometre time trial, which sadly is no longer on the Olympic agenda because they brought BMX in and had to drop some events. But there is no heat, first round, semi-final, quarter-final or whatever. You get on your bike and you ride 4 laps and that's it. And it is one of the very few Summer Olympic sports and events that is timed to 1/1000th of a second. It's normally 100th of a second in track and field and swimming and the likes. So 2 days before he rode, he did what's called a flying 500, where you go through the start-finish line at maximum velocity and see what time you can do. He set a personal best. When he got on his bike, Florine Rousseau, who ended up winning the gold medal when Kelly pulled his foot, was about 1.2 seconds outside Kelly's existing world record. So everything was primed, Dan, for him to join that pantheon of Olympic greatness by being able to say for the rest of your life you're a gold medal. And unfortunately, as we know, in the blink of an eye, his foot came out of the pedal, and that was it. His entire and that was his prime. You know, he'd won he finished behind Jose Marino in Spain, in Barcelona. That was his games. He was, I think, 26 years of age in his absolute prime, and that was the end. And it was a pretty hard thing to see. I know that his father, Brian, was in the back straight. I think it was Neil Kearney was there from Channel 7 ready to interview him because he was just expected to win.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, his father was in tears, and a remarkably sad event, no doubt about it.
I've spoken to him a few times since because he's been involved in cycling as a coach at the Victorian Institute of Sport. And he's pragmatic about it outwardly, but I reckon inwardly you can just still see the hurt.
Oh, definitely. You know, as we've been talking about, it separates you from other athletes. You know, 10,000 athletes go to each Olympic Games. I don't know how many gold medals, 368. I know some of them are, shared between 15 hockey players, but, they're a rare commodity. And the other thing, Dan, which makes the Olympics great is everything has to align. If we're talking about individuals in particular, everything has to align on one day at 1 hour. You spoke about AFL footy. If you have a bad season, you've got an opportunity next season. If you don't win the US Masters, you've got the US PGA coming up. If you don't win the Australian Open, you've got 3 more Grand Slams in the next 7 months. The Olympic Games, you've got 4 years to, and say Shane Kelly or a gymnast, you're probably preparing for 8 years for one particular Olympics. You wake up with a migraine, you wake up with nausea, everything is gone. There is it's waiting again. And you think back to the last Olympic Games, those athletes had to wait 5 years because Tokyo with COVID was pushed back a year. It is, again, what makes the Olympics so special. You have to peak on one day at one particular time that day. Otherwise, sadly, many of them will never be remembered. And that in itself is cruel.
The Paris Olympics coming up in 2 months' time. This is Dan Lonergan's, or Dashing Dan's Olympic Adventures. Our first guest is legendary broadcaster Glenn Mitchell. Glenn, you talked about peaking at the right time, and you mentioned the men's hockey team. Look, their record's outstanding in regard to silver medals and bronze medals. Just one gold medal. A guy we know very well, Rick Charlesworth, said in 76, and they got beaten 1-0 by New Zealand. They were probably not quite ready. Same group in 1980, he reckons, well, they'd won everything. They were primed and they had it taken away from them. 84, they were a little bit old. You're right. It's all about peaking, isn't it?
It is all about peaking. And even when Charlesworth, moved from the Hockey Roos to the Kookaburras, they'd won everything heading into London. They'd won the World Cup. They'd won a couple of Champions Trophies events. And alas for them, the biggest stage, they couldn't do it. It is that's something I do often reflect on is the fact that it is what really we talk about winners. Well, we talk about use the word like legend and great. In Australia, Ian Thorpe and Dawn Fraser and Kathy Freeman are Olympic legends, but to be an Olympic gold medalist, as I said, it is the ultimate in regard to everything of a sporting pursuit. You have to be physically strong enough and have done your preparation to be ready. You have to be incredibly mentally strong when you know that's your fortnight. Or, as I said in Shane Kelly's instance, that is your 1 hour. The whole event runs an hour, and his own race runs a minute. So, you do all this training to peak, to be ready for a 60-second event. Now, you break that down, how many minutes are there in 4 years? And it all compacts down to 60 seconds. To be able to win, it must be the most incredible exhilaration and adrenaline rush. But conversely, you've got to look at what a heartbreaking thing it must be in someone like Kelly's case, where it all just fell apart.
Our major sponsor for the program is Aussie Home Loans. Great to have them on board. And the big narrative around Aussie Home Loans is they can deal with anyone in Australia. They've got clients in every state and capital. They can also do Zoom as well. Now, Glenn, we were discussing about the fact that there aren't as many countries or cities bidding for the games. If you go back to 1993, it was the biggest story in Australia. There were many countries bidding and Sydney won it. I mean, gone are the days when that'll happen.
Yeah, well, if we go back even further, we had the incredible failure of Canada in 1976 with Montreal.
Correct.
The Montreal Games, the debt that was incurred, the debt to amortise it took the residents of Montreal and the council and everything like that decades to pay off. Now, it was such a disaster economically that when they had to bid for 1984, Los Angeles was the only city that put in a bid. And Peter Uberoth, who was the architect of it all, he was a baseball commissioner, the Major League Baseball commissioner, he built that whole bid around so much corporate money. And America has so much, IBM, Coca-Cola, all of those were putting money into it. But, in 1980, would have been 1977 or a little bit after that, when they opened bids for 84, one city. After that, when Uberoth was able to make it a financial success, all of a sudden we saw the return to days of old where a lot of cities were putting in. But in recent times, the sheer expense, I remember London, Dan, the talk was that the security bill, just the security bill for London was over $1 billion. That's not building facilities and upgrading infrastructure at airports and rail systems and building stadia. That was just to keep the athletes secure. A $1 billion budget, given we live in times with terrorism and the likes. So I think a lot of cities have been scared off now. Athens was an incredible games. The population of Greece is 4 million. I would dread to think how much debt they went into. So I think, unfortunately, down in the future, we've got Brisbane, but prior to Brisbane, we've got Paris and Los Angeles, massive, massive world cities. I think down the track, we're not going to see an Athens again. I doubt we'll see a Helsinki or an Amsterdam, as we've seen in the past. I think it will become the domain of incredibly big cities in incredibly strong economic countries, because other nations and cities, they won't be able to afford it. And the big thing, Dan, like everything in life, you want this one to be better than the last one.
You do.
So all the money and the investment in Paris, they want it better than Tokyo. Tokyo wanted it better than London. London wanted it better than Beijing. So they add all additional bells and whistles every 4 years. And of course, all that does is just, it just ratchets up the cost of it all.
I was lucky enough to go to London. It's one of the greatest experiences of my life. I thought it was fantastic. I felt safe, not that it mattered that much. As you say, it's all about the athletes, but I didn't know that the security bill was $100 billion. I worry about Brisbane because the big concern at the moment, Glenn, is the venues. They need new venues. The Gabba is old. With the greatest respect, a wonderful venue with some magnificent historical significance, but they've virtually got to start again, don't they? Demolish it and start from the ground up. I would have thought with the Gabba.
Yeah, I think it's pretty much incumbent, I think, down on a city that wins the rights to an event of such magnitude that they have at least one massive showcase. I mean, I can remember going to Beijing. There was two of them alongside each other. You had the Bird's Nest, which was an incredible piece of architecture, the main stadium, and I don't know, a walk of 400 metres, and you came to the water, the Cube. You know, that was an incredible venue where they held the swimming. So, you know, and you look at Homebush, you look at the stadium they built in London. Atlanta was a little bit different. That wasn't a great stadium, I must admit, because they built it to be configured for the Atlanta Braves once the games had finished, to move them across the road from Atlanta Fulton County Stadium. But I think it is incumbent to create something that in years to come, when people drive past it, when people visit Brisbane, wow, there is the Olympic Stadium. I think a revamped Gabba is not going to do that. No. And I think a bit like when you want to renovate a house, it's often cheaper to knock the house down and build a new one than it is to actually renovate. So I'm not too sure they're going to get a good bang for buck anyway. But, you know, it is interesting at the moment already. You know, they bid for it, they've got it, and now there's all this talk about how they're going to actually put it together. And the big thing is too, Dan, that lead-in times for an Olympic Games, a hell of a lot can change. You know, when you go back to Los Angeles, all of a sudden they had all the boycotts of the Eastern Bloc.
Yes.
Because that was a tit for tat, because the West, a lot of them didn't go to Moscow.
Correct.
Who knows what the world economic climate is going to be come 2032? How much more will it cost from what their preliminary estimates for were when they bid for the game? So there are a lot of intangibles, but I do hope that Brisbane builds something that is there and lasts for half a century as a monument to them actually holding the Olympics.
Do you think in the short term, Glenn, that Russia will ever be allowed back in as Russia?
I think they've got to do their penance. There's no doubt about that. I mean, what they did at Sochi, the Winter Olympics, was abhorrent. I mean, we talk about the greatness of the Olympics. I mean, that's all underpinned by, Baron Pierre de Coubertin's Olympic ideals. We have an athlete oath that one of the athletes of the host country stands up and reads, and, we will obey by the rules and obey by the officials. Well, what Russia did in 2014, and either side of it, they've been caught for other misdemeanors. I don't think they'll be coming back quickly, and I don't think they should either. I think something of that magnitude, you need to serve a significant penalty for it, and I think it might be another Olympiad, another Olympic cycle.
Glenn Mitchell, my guest on Dashing Dan's Olympic Adventures, the first of these podcasts on the lead up to the Olympic Games, a couple of months away in Paris. Looking forward to seeing how Australia go, and of course, we're here for Aussie Home Loan. They can deal with anyone in Australia, and they've got clients in every state and every capital around Australia. So great to have them on board as our major sponsor. Now, Glenn, you've broadcast, as I say, a lot of cycling. Favourite moment of the 4 Olympic Games you've done?
I suppose from a selfish Western Australian point of view, when Ryan Bailey won the men's sprint at Athens in 2004. Australia has produced so many outstanding cyclists. We'd never won that event, and the sprint on the velodrome is cycling's 100 metres for the track and field, and then for him to win the Kirin as well. So to become WA's first individual dual gold medalist, you have to go back to Shirley Strickland in an individual event. So you're going back more than half a century. I was incredibly fortunate in Athens because Australia won 6 cycling gold medals, 5 at the velodrome, and Sarah Carrigan won the road race. And I fully understood as a broadcaster. I mean, you can go through if you're with a certain country, or even if you're with Australia. If you're an Australian basketball commentator, you've never had the opportunity to call an Australian Olympic gold medal, and that extends across a lot of sports. So very fortunate to call 6 at one particular games. But yeah, I guess from a selfish point of view, seeing a young man from Perth who had a diet a bit like yours, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Dan, was his food of choice. Didn't quite fit in well with the dietitians at the AIS, but as they say, he got the job done.
And just on that, Glenn, I know that we've done well in cycling over the years. Could have we done a little bit better if it was centralised? Of course, I'm opening a can of worms here. I sat in an office with you a long time ago, and we were debating this, weren't we, about the way the setup was in the late 90s with the, and I'll say, I can say it now, the controversial Charlie Walsh. And he was controversial, wasn't he?
He was. I mean, it was a centralised program back then, but I think one of the big, it was based out of Adelaide, still is, but one of the issues I think back then was, I don't think there's been an Olympic sport in Australia that's been plagued with so much controversy in regard to selection. You know, we had Kathy Watt, we had Lucy Tyler-Sharman, Tony Davis from WA when he was up against Dean Woods for the individual pursuit in Seoul. You've got to go right back to 1988 for that. I think they made a lot of issues for themselves in regard to their selection criteria. And it seemed to be something that, according to head coaches and the likes, they could move the goalposts in regard to if they had personal favourites that they wished to have qualified, all of a sudden the qualifying criteria would change. Cycling has become an increasingly competitive sport. If you go back probably to the 1970s, for example, there weren't many outliers. It was mainly the Europeans and perhaps the United States. There are prominent cyclists now from other countries, and in particular, if you look at road cycling now, I mean, you've got riders like Pogacar, Vingegaard from Denmark. You've got so many riders that are prominent at the Tour de France. South Americans, Colombians are terrific climbers. Go back to the days of Eddie Merckx and Bernardino back into the 60s, into the 70s, into the 80s. A bit like tennis. I mean, this plethora of what used to be the Eastern Bloc. I mean, how many tennis players? Look at Novak Djokovic as a prime example, and Sharapova. All those that have come from areas that back in the days of Margaret Court and Ken Rosewall and Rod Laver, those people didn't exist. So cycling's become more of a global sport, which has made it more difficult for Australia to dominate, much the same way as we don't dominate the Davis Cup like we used to.
Will we ever have another Anna Meares? I mean, Anna Meares as a person, Anna Meares as a sports person, and Anna Meares as a cyclist. I mean, the one person, she's a ripper, isn't she?
She is. I've been very fortunate to have a lot to do with Anna, interviewing her at various events and the likes. I think it's still the most inspirational. I mean, I was at the pool in '96, not commentating, but at the pool in Atlanta when Perkins won his second gold medal. And that was an incredible backstory that, he only just qualified for the Australian team. He only qualified by less than 0.1 of a second into lane 8, and he won. But the most inspirational event I've ever seen was calling Anna Meares when she won that silver medal, not a gold medal, but when she was beaten by Victoria Pendleton in Beijing. She broke her neck in a horrific fall in Los Angeles, less than 5 months from those games. She was millimetres away from being in a wheelchair for the rest of her life. You've got the psychological issue of overcoming that. You've got the physical issue of overcoming it. For her to come back so quickly, I don't think anyone really thought, when she was wheeled through the Sydney airport and she was in a wheelchair and a neck brace, I don't think anyone thought, well, this woman will be vying for a gold medal in a few months' time. Incredible. And now it's fantastic to see, Dan, that she's the chef de mission. And she will provide so much inspiration for these athletes, these Australian athletes of all sports in Paris. I think that is a wonderful choice to have Anna Meares as the chef de mission of the Australian team.
She put a great full stop in her career when she won gold in London in 2012. And our wonderful colleague, the late, great Drew Morford, called that particular event against Pendleton. She was hoping to win gold in her last Olympic Games in front of a home crowd. And Drew, being Drew, had tears in his eyes. I mean, it was one of the great moments, not only in broadcasting, but obviously in Australian cycling, that, as you say, she'd had the injury a few years earlier. She'd got a silver medal and she had one more in her, and just that steely determination to find a way to win gold. I mean, you just cannot beat that, can you?
You can't. I mean, she did go around again. She went to Rio. She actually carried the flag in Rio. But by that time, I think she tossed after Rio about whether going on to the Gold Coast Commonwealth Games in 2018, where if she had it, she would have ridden in a velodrome that was named, it was the Anna Meares Velodrome.
Yeah.
But when you talk about greatness in Australian sport, Dan, there are very few that have a CV that matches her. We know that she's a dual Olympic gold medalist, but she's also an 11-time world champion. And in that, one of the great, or one of the awful things about her career is that she won the Athens 500-meter time trial. She set a world record, and she set several world records after that. But again, like Shane Kelly, after 2004, the half-kilometre, the 500-metre time trial was removed from the Olympic program. So when you talk to her, she always jokes and says, I'm still the reigning Olympic champion, which she is. The event doesn't exist. But her dominance of that event for the bulk of her career, I think she would have won at least one more Olympic gold medal, if not two.
We're here for Aussie Home Loans, and remember, they deal with anyone in Australia. They've got clients in every state and every capital, and they do Zoom as well. Just talking of sports and events that are no longer with us, do you think we've got too many recreational events part of Olympic Games now, Glenn? I mean, break dancing, sports, rock climbing. Look, wonderful, these people, what they do. If they're in the Olympic Games, why isn't a sport like 10-pin bowling or a recreational event like 10-pin bowling or chess or one of those, or are we going a bit too far?
To my way of thinking, yes, but you and I, Dan, love Test cricket, whereas younger people like T20. Correct. And I think that's the issue, is that the Olympic Games now has to cater for a very Catholic audience, a very broad audience. And whilst people that play water polo, taekwondo, archery, synchronized swimming, handball, they are immersed in the sport, a lot of people can't get into it. And when I say get into it, don't have the passion that people do that compete in it. So I think a bit like using cricket as an example, cricket went from the traditional one form of Test cricket, decided to go to one-day cricket. They then decided, because of the attention span, let's go to a 3.5-hour game and make it T20. I think if they just purely and simply kept the existing diet, I think it would lose a little bit of its lust. When I say lust, it would lose interest perhaps among the younger generations.
Right.
So they relate to skateboarding. They relate to indoor rock climbing. They relate to surfing, for example, now. You and I and people of our vintage and older probably raise our eyebrows when these sports get introduced. But the Olympic Games, to remain relevant, probably has to move in a similar vein to what cricket has done in the last 25 or 30 years.
E-gaming's the other one, isn't it? I mean, it's massive now. There's a lot of people that do that, not only in Australia, but right around the world. It's certainly on its way. But you talked about T20 cricket. I mean, that's likely to become a staple diet if the Olympics continue in the long term. I know it's, I think Los Angeles it'll be in because of the T20 World Cup occurring in America in the next couple of months or so. And then, of course, it'll be there in Brisbane as well. So T20 cricket, with so many countries playing it now, is going to be a big part, isn't it?
It is. I mean, for a long time, I railed against the idea of cricket because I think the Olympic Games needs to have a very broad base. Having said that, I mean, a sport like handball isn't played in a lot of countries, but for a long period of time, if you're going to put cricket into the Olympic Games, you might have only had 3 teams that were probably going to win. Yeah. But, you know, nowadays, you know, you've obviously got Australia, England, India, but, you know, you wouldn't discount a Pakistan. You wouldn't discount well, I was going to say you wouldn't discount a West Indies. You would, because there is no West Indies at the Olympics. But it's an example that, you know, the West Indies have won a couple of T20 World Cups, and yet as a cricket nation, in inverted commas, they're a collection of nations and islands that play as the West Indies. They do very little outside T20 cricket. And as we know, I mean, T20 cricket, you know, you only need one good innings or one good bowling spell. And by dint of that, a Sri Lanka, a New Zealand, it doesn't have to be the big boys that could come up with a gold medal. The other thing is, again, Dan, that one of the driving forces for the IOC to bring cricket in is India, because despite it being the most populous nation in the world now, overtaking China, it doesn't really have a great interest in Olympic sports. They dominated hockey about 1928 to 1956. They won something like 6 gold medals. Remarkably, I think it was might have been Beijing, that they produced their first ever individual gold medals, and that was in the sport of shooting.
Yes.
So again, we're talking about India, we're talking about the IOC trying to make these games relevant. You've got about what, a fifth or a sixth of the world's population in India, and they don't really care much about the Olympics. So bring in a sport that is a religion to them, and you get all of a sudden India tacked on. And Dan, when you get India tacked on, you get money tacked on. I mean, India is such a growing economy. I was staggered. I went to India 6 times with the ABC doing cricket and Commonwealth Games. From the very first time I went to the last, the change in that country, the dynamic, the growing middle class, the growing affluence of so many Indians, you can see why the IOC has brought in cricket, because they will be rubbing their hands together thinking that this will really impact their bank balance. And as we know, Dan, the IOC likes money.
They certainly do. Now, in regard to the IOC, do you think because they like money and because India is so big that they'd look at an Indian city to host the Olympic Games, even though, as you say, outside cricket, they're not really interested in sport or the Olympics?
I think that could be something, but I can't see it happening in the near future.
Right.
I think they would have to develop a passion for it. I think in a perfect world, the IOC will be hoping that India wins the T20 Olympic gold medal in LA, and that may create amongst the Indian public a fervour in sport rather than just cricket. Because I can guarantee you that if India gets knocked out at however they're going to have at a quarter-final stage or whatever in the cricket, then interest will go out the door in regard to India. They love their team. They love their team when it's winning. I think if they could build a little bit of an Olympic heritage, I wouldn't mind betting that they could. I mean, in Delhi and Mumbai are probably 2 of the biggest 6 or 7 cities in the world. And as I said, money, they are now a giant economy. I mean, they're the 3rd biggest economy behind the US and China now. So they're growing more rich every year. And yeah, I wouldn't put it past them that maybe one of their super cities could one day host the games.
I mean, we saw in the 50 over World Cup last year that when the game was slipping away, they lost interest, didn't they? I mean, the crowd was up and about and the burble around the ground was unbelievable. And as soon as Australia got on top in the run chase, you could hear a pin drop. It was just amazing, and how disappointed they were and how engaged they are with their cricket team, especially emotionally engaged.
Well, I mean, for so long, cricket was, it was an English sport for a long time, and then it was an Anglo-English sport, if you like. But really, the soul of cricket nowadays is India. That's where the most interest is. You go to England now, if there's a test match on, sometimes it's 7 pages inside the back page, unless something remarkable has happened. Even in off-season, soccer is getting more coverage than a test match being played at Headingley or Old Trafford. So the financial power of cricket is now in India. The passion is in India. But you're right. I mean, in that part of the world, it doesn't happen nowadays, but, there have been cricketers that played for Pakistan that would go home and their house would have been burnt down. They'd burn effigies of players in the streets. It is a religion to them in that part of the world. One of the great sadnesses in world sport, Dan, is that we, outside an IOC event, World Cups, we don't say India play Pakistan. I mean, an India-Pakistan test series in India, you'd have to shut the gates, 4 hours before the game started. They would be overflowing and the passion would be enormous. But because of the political climate over there, we're not going to see it in the short to medium term, unfortunately.
Well, they're looking to maybe hold a test here in Australia at the MCG, considering they had that T20 fixture. The crowd was unbelievable. This is our first podcast on the lead up to the Olympic Games, Dashing Dan's Olympic Adventures. Glenn Mitchell is my guest, legendary sports commentator. Thanks to Aussie Home Loans. They deal with anyone in Australia. They've got clients in every state and capital. They do Zoom as well. And their areas of expertise include purchasing a property, building a property portfolio, debt consolidation, and refinancing. Glenn, what's bigger, the Soccer World Cup or the Olympic Games nowadays?
The FIFA World Cup, they say, draws a bigger world global television audience. I mean, soccer is everywhere. We're talking about cricket not being played in a lot of countries at a high level, and we talk about handball and other Olympic sports. I mean, soccer is everywhere, and I think it's largely because of the cost. Aside from track and field, I mean, track and field you can play barefooted. In soccer you can play barefooted when you're growing up. All you need is a ball, and sometimes it's not even a regulation ball; it's something that they've just constructed. And soccer, because it came out of England and the empire extended everywhere, and not just the British Empire, but the reason soccer is so big in places like Brazil and Uruguay is because it was British engineers that went and built the rail systems over in countries that weren't part of the Commonwealth. So as a result, soccer was being played there. So it's a true global sport. My interest has always been more towards the Olympics than soccer.
Yeah.
But you always know that there's not so much the rivalry, but how much the FIFA protects the World Cup by dint of the fact that at the Olympics it's an under-23 event. Yeah. They don't want the Olympics, what they would see, FIFA would see, grabbing onto the coattails of their sport. So they have an open competition for women, but the men's is under 23. But I mean, the way I look at it is that the largest individual sporting event in the world is the FIFA World Cup. The largest multi-sport event is the Olympics. But I think I'm right in saying that in recent times, FIFA, the World Cup, has pulled a bigger international audience than what they do for the Olympic Games.
And is the men's 100 metres sprint in athletics still the biggest ticket in town at the Olympic Games, or is that changing a bit?
No, I think it is. I think there's always a fascination with this is not being disparaging, but we always talk about the fastest man on the planet. It's also the fastest woman. But
yeah,
I think because it is such a relatable event. Every single one of us, even if you hate sport, had to run the 100 metres in a school carnival. So every one of us have done that. Not every one of us have swum 50 metres in an Olympic pool. If you go to places like Africa, there aren't any Olympic 50-metre pools in some countries in an entire nation. So 100 metres is something that all of us in our own mind can relate to. Not all of us have been on parallel bars in gymnastics. Not all of us have shot a rifle or used an archery bow, an arrow, but every one of us have run 100 metres. And I think when we see someone run it as Bolt did at 9.58, which is the world record still,
yeah,
I think we're mystified. We're blown away because it is something we can directly relate to. And I think, and then added, you're the fastest person in the world to have ever done it. I think it will always underpin. And as a result, athletics will always underpin. And I think getting back to Cathy Freeman winning that gold medal at the Sydney Olympic Stadium meant so much. It was almost the cherry on top of what Australia did, in building that games, in building the infrastructure and having the great weather, having the party atmosphere. Freeman was that little cherry on top of a massively well-baked and cooked cake. Had she not won, there would have been a hollow feeling that Australia never won at the main stadium.
Well, we talk about Bruce McAvaney and Tim Lane's wonderful calls, but everyone has to remember Raylene Boyle's line at the end. I mean, the way she just came in straight after Bruce, it was like it was rehearsed, and apparently it wasn't rehearsed. What a relief. I mean, that'll go down in folklore as one of the great lines in sports commentary, won't it?
And it was. And I don't think it was necessarily, I think it was a great relief for whatever our population was back then, 23 or 24 million, because everybody wanted to see Cathy Freeman win. And, she carried enormous pressure because, you had Tatiana Grigorieva, and she won the silver medal the same night in the pole vault, but I don't think people really saw her as being an Olympic champion. But everything that Freeman had done. Also, I know in the end, Jose Maria Perec pulled out, but it was that rivalry. and the fact that, you know, the pressure was ramped up by getting her to light the cauldron. So the whole focus was on this young girl from Queensland. And I think, you know, I'm sure Raylene Boyle was talking not just about Freeman, but talking about the nation as a whole. We all exhaled, what a relief. Kathy has won. And, you know, I know people talk about, you know, the America's Cup in 83 in Newport, but, you know, I think if there's any event in the history of Australian sport that could top it and may even sit above it, is Kathy Freeman's win at the Sydney Olympics.
To these Olympic Games, Glenn, we're expecting our women swimmers again to dominate. We've got some magnificent women swimmers, Emma McKeon and Ariana Titmus are two of our greats. Molly O'Callaghan's another one. Well, you talked earlier about Anna Meares and the number of world championships she's won, and the fact that there was a certain young lady who hadn't won a gold medal in Olympics, and she did it in 2012. And I remember back in the last Olympic Games 2021, I remember in 2012 she was 18 years old and she was the 11th qualifier in the K1 of the slalom canoeing. I'm talking, of course, of Jessica Fox, and for a long time she was provisional gold medalist until the last competitor ended up going past her. She got the monkey off the back in 2021. If she manages to win another gold medal, Jessica Fox, at these Olympic Games, she'll be seen as one of our greatest ever Olympians, won't she?
Oh, no doubt. No doubt. And I think she's got the capability of doing it. And one of the biggest threats could be her own sister. But
yes,
she is an Olympic great already, I think. She takes on both events in the whitewater slalom or the canoeing events. One of the great things about the Olympics, Dan, is that every Olympic Games, pretty much, we get someone that hits the headlines that largely, even you and I, as sports broadcasters, perhaps haven't greatly heard of. I mean, Lauren Burns won the Taekwondo gold medal in Sydney. I mean, if you had walked through the Hay Street Mall where I am, or walked down Burke Street where you are, and said Lauren Burns, not many people would know. Simon Fairweather in archery. We will get people that, and some of them will become, maybe not forever, but for a large slab of time, will become household names in Australia, people that at the moment, most of us have never ever heard of. And that's one of the great things about the Olympics, is it always throws up these stories. Yes, there's always the Emma McKeons and the Anna Meares and the Kieran Perkins who go to an Olympics with such great fanfare and expectation. But often it's the ones that we never heard of that actually provide the richest and the greatest and the most memorable stories.
Russell Mark's another one. Michael Diamond's another one that come to mind. I always remember Simon Fairweather because the great Peter Wilkins was broadcasting a soccer match with Roger Wills in Sydney. And Peter Longman, our boss at the Times, come out to him and said, now, Wilco, you've got to do the archery. He said, what's that? He'd never heard of it. He said, is there anyone there that has got any notes? And, of course, you being you had said to me, now, Daniel, what you need to do, because you're the most inexperienced member of the team, just learn every minor sport. And I was, of course, Australia's foremost handball commentator, only handball commentator. So I'm going to take that to my grave at this stage, Glenn, depending what happens with the ABC in LA in 2032 and other commentators. But anyway, I digress, as I'm very good at. And then I was helping Wilco go over the archery, and he did a great job. And he said, geez, I didn't even know archery existed at the Olympic Games. So that's what you often get, don't you?
Well, that's right. Jerry Collins, who was a renowned swimming commentator. In fact, I would think in the history of Australia, he would have called more gold medals, Australian gold medals, than anyone else. He's called more than Norman May did. Jerry did Lauren Burns' Taekwondo gold medal live on ABC Radio as well. My wife, Karen Tai, actually called an Olympic gold medal in diving in Athens, even though she wasn't necessarily a commentator, but a broadcaster. But she was the last one that was in the International Broadcast Centre in the ABC area when the diving was about to happen. So, yeah, every Olympic Games is fantastic. And it's not just us. I mean, we, especially now with the volume of the media and everything online, we'll get great stories of people that have come out of villages in Central Africa or someone out the back of the Amazon, that has gone and won an Olympic gold medal or become the first Olympic champion for their country. The Olympic Games is the ultimate storyteller. We talk about sport always being a microcosm of life, that you see everything, the gamut, from great joy to incredible sadness and desperation and desolation. But it provides so many stories, and Paris will be exactly the same. And that is why, as we get closer and closer to Brisbane, we will again start to study up. And I don't just mean you and I.
Yep.
Australians will study up on the Olympics, because it is the biggest game in town, and it's coming to our own shores. And whether you live in Perth or you live in Carnarvon or you live in Melbourne, it is going to be Australia's Olympics as much as it is Brisbane's Olympics.
You've done 4 Olympic Games. You've done many test matches. You've done a lot of Australian rules football. You've done just about every sport you could possibly do. Is the Olympic Games still a pinnacle for you, Glenn, throughout your long and storied career as one of Australia's great sports broadcasters?
Most definitely, Dan. When I joined the ABC, there were 2 things I wanted to do: Test cricket, which I was very lucky to do for a long period of time, and go to an Olympic Games. And I still see the Olympics as the pinnacle of world sport. And we said right at the beginning, everything has to align. And again, you know, Test cricket, sometimes with away tours, I'd call 8, 9, 10 Test matches home and away in any calendar year. To go to an Olympic Games every 4 years was a privilege and quite an honour. And I think for broadcasters like you and I and everyone that was at the ABC, whilst we never, ever put ourselves in the category of being an Olympic athlete, I think being a sports broadcaster and having the ability to actually go to an Olympics and sit behind a microphone and commentate on the Olympic Games, you're a pretty rare breed. You know, we go back to the Sydney Olympic Games and Kathy Freeman. There would have been Tim Lane, Bruce McAvaney and Ray Hadley would have been the only 3 Australians that called that event. So it's a very, very, where you think of how many people call AFL footy or rugby league in a year. So no, for me, the Olympics has always been the most enjoyable and the most memorable thing I did in my broadcasting career.
Well, you and I met the great late now Muhammad Ali, didn't we, in the IBC at the Sydney Olympic Games? That was a magnificent highlight. We just happened to be walking through, and there he was, and we went up to him and shook his hand. That was a great moment.
Well, that was, Dan, a reminder to me of just how great Ali was.
Yeah.
I mean, as you would know, that the IBC, the International Broadcast Centre, houses the world's electronic media, TV and radio. So you've got from the BBC to the ABC to radio South Korea, television in Bolivia. And when Ali was brought through in a golf cart, he was an ambassador at that stage for the IOC and was being taken through the IBC to go to the area where the television coverage, their muster control, was being put together. I can't imagine anyone else, even if they had said Michael Jordan's outside or if it's Don Bradman, would mean nothing to Brazilians. I don't think anybody, you know, you and I saw doors open in that corridor, and people were coming out from South Korea, from New Zealand, from America, from Lithuanian television, because it was Muhammad Ali. To see him from a couple of feet away is an incredible memory. And I think, as I said, I don't know any other athlete in the world that would have got commentators that were covering their 8th Olympic Games that had seen so much would come out and be so excited and beaming because they got to see Muhammad Ali in the flesh.
The other interesting thing about that, Glenn, was that, look, he wasn't all that well then, but he seemed to understand how big he still was. And we know he had a huge ego. Often I think that was for the camera, wasn't it? But he knew how big he was. He knew that everyone was there to see him at the time. And that's what sort of added to the mystique of it, didn't it?
Well, he's one of the most unique sports people. In fact, probably the most unique in regard to his standing in the world as to what he was able to do. For a long period of time, he lived with his last wife, Lonnie, in a little town called Berrien Springs, which was a very short drive away from Notre Dame, as they call it. We say Notre Dame, but Notre Dame University there. And if you were a student and you wanted to get in your car and drive the 40-odd minutes to Berrien Springs and knock on his front door, you'd be invited into his lounge room and you could sit with Muhammad Ali. And he had a great love of doing magic tricks, pretty basic ones. But Ali was open and available to everyone. And you look nowadays in sports, you've got to get through media managers and all sorts of things before you can, maybe book an interview with an athlete in 11 weeks' time. Muhammad Ali was amazing. His accessibility and his knowledge, I think, that he could make everybody's day brighter. And you think of when he swung through, not the Rumble in the Jungle in 1974, but he went on other occasions to Africa. And, there were people 10 deep on the roads, in a little African city that were there because it was Muhammad Ali. Again, we talk about this has probably been watered down now by two things. One is the fact that there are so many boxing belts. You've got the WBO, the WBC, the WBA. Every now and then you get someone that consolidates them. But, I go back to my youth, world heavyweight fights. Frazier Foreman, Frazier Ali, Ali Foreman. They were huge sporting events.
They were.
And there's the old saying or the old thing that, you could walk into somewhere in the Amazon and show some people a photo of Queen Elizabeth, the President of the United States, the Pope, and Muhammad Ali, and everyone would be able to tell you one of them and not the other three. I mean, he was a global institution. And it's a really, I don't know what he'd be like in the era of social media, Dan, crikey. He'd be explosive. But it is a great shame. It is a great shame that, more athletes haven't, I guess, followed his lead and been so accessible to the little person rather than sort of living in an ivory tower and being secluded away from the people that, in the end, they are the ones that pay their salary. It's the fans that gets the bums on the seat, which gets TV, which ends up putting the money in the athlete's pocket.
It's a very different world. Now, before I let you go, Glenn, and I really appreciate your time, of those 4 Olympic Games, is there one that was your favourite one? Was it the Athens one because you called 6 gold medals? Was it Sydney because it was the home one? Was it Atlanta because it was the first one? Or was it Beijing because of maybe the venues and just the atmosphere?
Well, Atlanta was underwhelming. I thought it was, for America, it was an incredibly poorly organised games. I didn't leave there with any great memories. It was exciting. It was my first Olympics, but they didn't do it well. Sydney was brilliant. But for me, Athens also, I enjoyed it more than any because I got, as I said, called 6 Australian gold medals, but it was, you're returning to the spiritual home. You were going back to, the very first day we went around the Panathenaic Stadium, the old stadium where they held archery this time around, but it was a stadium they used for the 1896, the first modern Olympic Games. And I was very lucky to broadcast for the ABC the opening ceremony in Athens. Wow. And just the historic nature of being in not far from, the fields of Olympia where the ancient Olympics were held up until 776 BC. Beijing I found very sterile, not surprisingly. One of the great things at the Olympics, if you can't pay to get into an Olympic event, you can go and stand on the barricade and watch the marathon or the walkers or the cycling leg of the triathlon. When they did that in Beijing, there was about a 50-metre gap between where the athletes were and where you were on a barricade. So it had a very sterile feeling. But Sydney was the most successful Olympics I went to in regard to venues and everything like that, and was acknowledged by Samaranch. But I just found Athens duly special for a selfish reason of having the ability to call so many Australian gold medals, but just to go to the home of the Olympics, the soul and the history of it was probably the one that resonated with me the most.
It was also special too, Glenn, because you had to help find a balding commentator who got lost going for a run on the first day, Glenn.
Well, it's very lucky, Dan, that Athens had a very good embassy. Otherwise, we could still be looking for you.
Correct. 20 years later, and of course, I'd forgotten to bring my pass and all sorts of things. It wasn't a good start, but we had a great time. Glenn, it's been a privilege to chat to you. You are the Oracle. You're one of the great sports broadcasters of all time. You did a lot for my career. It's always wonderful talking about the Olympic Games. I can't wait to see what happens in Paris, and we hope that the Olympics become bigger and better as we go forward after Paris to LA and then to Brisbane in 2032. And thanks for being my first guest on Dashing Dan's Olympic Adventures for Aussie Home Loan and, of course, their areas of expertise purchasing a property, building a property portfolio, refinancing, debt consolidation, cash out construction and pre-approvals, and they can deal with anyone in Australia. They've got clients in every state and capital. They can also do Zoom as well. It's been a pleasure, Glenn, and we'll catch up really soon. And send my love to Karen, one of the all-time greats as well.
Good on you, Dan, and don't change the name of the series, mate. I think it's a winner.
Oh, good on you, Glenn. Thanks very much. We'll speak soon. The great Glenn Mitchell joining us on Dashing Dan's Olympic Adventures for Aussie Home Loans.